Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Pamela from the Alberta Wilderness Association. And today I'm going to give a talk on caribou and bison conservation. But before we do that, I would like to do a land acknowledgement. So the Alberta Wilderness Association acknowledges the traditional land we're currently on, which is Treaty 6 territory. We would like to thank the diverse Indigenous peoples whose ancestors' footsteps have marked this territory for centuries, such as the Ne'ihiya, Cree, Dene, Anishinaabe, Saulteaux, Nakota Iska, Nakota Sioux, and Itzitaki, Blackfoot peoples. We also acknowledge this as the Métis homeland and one of the largest communities of Inuit south of the 60th parallel. As a provincial organization, AWA also includes treaties 4, 6, 7, 8, and 10. Thank you. Okay, so the talk today is, like I said, conservation of caribou and bison. Lindsay, can you go to the next one, please? But before we talk about that, like I said, my name is Pamela Narváez-Torres. I'm a conservation specialist at the Alberta Wilderness Association, or AWA. And AWA is an environmental nonprofit, federally registered charitable society, and we're dedicated to the conservation of wilderness and the completion of a protected areas network. And AWA is a voice for the environment in our province, and we are the first conservation organization that was founded in the province, which that was since 1965. So this year is our 60th anniversary. And AWA has active members around Alberta and also around the world, and we have over 10,000 members currently. So before we start talking about bison and caribou, I wanted to give you a brief introduction to what a species at risk is, in case you are not familiar with the term. So it is actually a very straightforward definition. If you actually go onto the Canada's or Alberta's website, basically a species at risk is a species at risk, as they describe it. But it's basically a species that if some actions are not taken, they're actually very close to being either extirpated or to going extinct. And at least in our province, some of the things that could cause populations or species to be close to being extirpated or extinct is changes on their habitat. So basically habitat loss, fragmentation, habitat destruction, disturbance, anything related to the area where they live. Something else is disease. So we have lots of diseases going in the province. One of them is chronic wasting disease or anthrax in bison, bovine tuberculosis, brucellosis, etc. We also have human wildlife interactions, things we see like with grizzly bears, or people just interacting with wildlife, issues in highways and things like that. And we also have flood and drought, just like more like natural climate change related things. So there are different categories for species at risk. So we have extinct, which basically like the species no longer exists in the wild anywhere in the world. We also have extirpated. This basically means more that a species is gone in a particular area. So if we have populations of animals around the landscape, maybe a bucket of animals here disappear, that means that the species is extirpated there, but it exists somewhere else. We also have endangered, which are at immediate risk of extirpation. So basically they're like almost gone. Threatened is a step below that. So they're at risk at becoming endangered and then going extirpated or extinct. And both endangered and threatened are kind of like the categories that are included under the Wildlife Act in our province. And so threatened are the species that we're going to be talking about today, which is bison or buffalo and caribou. Grizzly bears, I think they're also threatened or endangered, and the sage grouse is endangered. We also have species of special concern. So basically just a step below, knowing that if actions are not taken, they could become threatened, then endangered. Then there's also species that we don't have enough information on, so we can't really place them in any category because there's not enough data on how they're doing. So now we're going to talk about caribou. Does anyone know anything about caribou, their characteristics, where they are, anything you want to share? You don't have to. Okay, that's all right. We're going to talk about caribou, but I just wanted to share with you what AWA's vision is for caribou, which is basically we want Alberta's woodland caribou to survive and recover to a self-sustaining state. So we don't want any human interaction to be helping them survive. We just want them to be able to do it by themselves, to have the the environment and the resources they need to be self-sustaining. So woodland caribou, we have in Alberta just these subspecies of caribou, which is the woodland caribou. Their scientific name is Rangifer caribou, and they're part of the deer family. So they're there with moose, elk, and other deer species. Like I mentioned, they're considered a certain species, and in Alberta, we divide them in like two different groups or ecotypes. That is the boreal and the southern mountain caribou. The females can have one calf per year, and they live around 10 to 15 years in the wild. It's gonna be tons. They're usually weigh around 100 to 200 kilograms. They're 1 to 1.2 meters tall, so basically maybe just like around my height, a little bit taller with their antlers. They have these creamy white patches in their neck, sometimes their belly, and in their bump. And something really interesting about caribou is that both males and females have antlers, and they're the only deer species where this happens. So if you see like a white-tailed deer in the wild with antlers, it's a male. But if you see from afar caribou with antlers, you can't really tell if it's a male or can't use the antlers to tell. They also have this particular hooves that help them, next please, distribute their weight, especially in muddy or snowy environments. And they usually also use these ones to dig into snow and to cut through the ice. So they use them for digging and to get the lichen that they like eating. So lichen comprises 70% or around 70% of their diet. And something really important about this is that lichen grows in old growth forests. So really, really old forests that are around over 80 years old. So that's where that lichen grows. That's why old growth forest is really important for caribou. They also eat other plants, like plants that looks like grasses. And in ecology, we say that they're an indicator species. So basically, they indicate how the environment is doing. They're very sensitive to changes in their habitat. So if we start seeing declines in their habitat, that means that the environment or their habitat is not doing really well, which could be impacting other species around. So in Alberta, we have 15 populations of caribou in public lands. So sorry, this doesn't look right now, but this here, like this little gray part at the bottom of the screen, that's where Edmonton is, where we are right now. And these are basically the 15 populations we have. So these three that are in blue on the bottom left, those are the Southern Mountain Caribou. So we have the Alapech, Red Rock Prairie Creek, and Narraway. And at least the Narraway and Red Rock Prairie Creek live both in Alberta and in BC. Then the Little Smoky, and then all in the boreal, those are boreal caribou. And like I said, we have around 12 populations. They're all like kind of like all around the North province. So boreal caribou in particular, those are the red kind of like blobs. They move around their environment. It all depends on changes in the environment, like fires or disturbances. So they move around their habitat. And they primarily choose wetlands and older conifer or mixed conifer forests. And some of those populations prefer forests that are over 60 years old, where some of them are more selective and they like forests that are over 80 years old. And Southern Mountain Caribou, so that would be the ones in the mountains, kind of like north of Jasper. They prefer forests that are over 80 years old. And something very, very important about these populations is that they migrate seasonally. So they spend their summers up in the mountains, in the alpine, and then they come back in the winter to the foothills. So actually what you see mostly in those, in the blue kind of like dotted areas, that's mostly their winter habitat. So they go down to the foothills and that's when they spend most of their time. And this, on this talk, we're going to be mostly focusing on the Red Rock Prairie Creek and the Narraway populations. And so now we're going to talk about why are caribou at risk. So there's many things affecting caribou, but kind of like the main thing that affects them is habitat loss and fragmentation. And there's also predation, but predation comes from habitat loss and fragmentation. So I just wanted to show you here with this image that I put together. So I don't know if everyone is familiar with seismic lines. So they're basically lines for oil and gas exploration. So they have to cut kind of like these roads and make these quadrants. And this creates fragmentation of their habitat. So instead of being like one big mass of forest, now we have all these avenues that are created for other animals to use. And what happens when these areas are cut down or like where these kind of like avenues are created is that other animals can use them and like other vegetation starts growing, which other animals like. So different species of deer like these newer plants that are growing, and also moose, they really like going into those areas. So areas that they weren't visiting before, that wasn't part of their regular habitat, now are easily accessible to them. So when these animals or when these other deer start coming up in the area, what follows? Wolves. And then wolves follow those animals, they also encounter caribou. And that's how predation has become a big issue for caribou. And that's all because of habitat loss. So we actually worked on fixing habitat loss. That problem will stop, but we're going to talk about that in a second. So now we're going to go a little bit into the history of why caribou is at risk and like why are we in the situation that we are today. So at the beginning of the 1900s, we knew that caribou populations were stable in the province and around 2/3 of the province had caribou living in them. Having by the 1930s, the province started documenting declines in their populations, and they were linked to habitat decrease because of logging. So we knew from like 100 years or like 90 years ago that there was an issue with logging affecting caribou. Then I jumped to the 1950s, there was a ban on hunting caribou, but that didn't last very long, maybe a couple of years, but then hunting continued. Then between the 1960s and 1990s, there was more research showing that logging was causing a big impact on caribou. Like there was a clear link on habitat loss affecting caribou because they need those old forests where they can access their lichen. Then oil and gas exploration entered the picture with those seismic plans that I showed during exploration. And there was a lot of research that showed that the areas where industry came, caribou left. So they were not compatible. And the habitat loss and population declines continue. And AWA, especially from like the 70s, AWA started advocating for caribou a lot. And one of the biggest things that was done in the 1980s, 1981, the license hunting of caribou ended in Alberta, and it hasn't come back after that. So it stopped in the 80s, and no more hunting has happened. The only people that were allowed to hunt were Indigenous peoples, but they have also stopped. So no more hunting of caribou. So in 2003, woodland caribou finally made it to the Species at Risk Act. And basically, they were listed as threatened. And this meant that actually some protection needed to happen for caribou. We needed to start taking actions to protect caribou, even we didn't want them to become endangered. So that meant that province and the federal government had to start developing plans. And yeah, a lot of things happened. Status reports were released, plans for their conservation were released, but not actual concrete actions for the protection happened. Then in 2014, there was the Southern Mountain Caribou Federal Recovery Strategy, which basically identified that large ranges are relatively undisturbed, interconnected habitat were needed. They also said that caribou needed 65% of habitat, undisturbed habitat, to have a 60% chance of becoming self-sustaining. So if we wanted them to have a chance of making it by themselves, we needed to give them 65% undisturbed habitat. And they also recognized that habitat alteration was happening throughout their distribution, which was causing population declines. So then 2015, it was finally one of a concrete action that happened was predator control. So like I mentioned, we knew that wolves were causing predation issues on caribou. So finally in 2015, but I would say this was against AWA's recommendation, wolf culling started. So we said, okay, wolf culling is okay, controlling populations to give caribou a chance is fine, but not as the only measure you'll ever take to protect caribou. So if you're not actually fixing habitat loss, then you can keep killing wolves forever, and caribou we're not going to have a habitat to go to. So that happened in 2015. And then in 2018, the federal government released what's called an imminent threat assessment, which recognized that 2 populations of southern mountain caribou required immediate intervention if we didn't want them to go extirpated or to disappear from the environment. However, so basically what happens when you do an imminent threat assessment is it can trigger a few things. So one of them is an emergency order. So that emergency order is like, you have to protect the critical habitat of the species. And the other thing that can happen is that the federal government signs an agreement with another party under the Species at Risk Act to take actions to protect caribou. And that's actually the route that the government took. So they signed an agreement in 2020. They signed a Section 11 agreement between Alberta and Canada. And in this conservation agreement, Alberta agreed to produce 11 sub-regional plans to recover those 15 caribou populations I showed a few maps ago. And this gave the province 5 years. So between 2020 and 2025, the province had 5 years to produce 11 sub-regional plans. So basically, what do we do in this area to get to that 65% of disturbed habitat to support caribou? However, it's almost the end of 2025, and only two of those 11 plans have been finalized. And earlier this year in March, they released the third plan, but it's still in draft form. And so, yeah, there was a public engagement period where they gave the public 90 days to provide feedback. And we know that a new version will be reviewed and approved by cabinet sometime soon, but we don't know that. So this is the plan that I actually wanted to talk to you about, which is the draft Upper Smoky regional plan, which is the plan that was released back in March. So this is for those two populations that we call the Upper Smoky. So the Upper Smoky is divided in the Narrowway and the Red Rock Prairie Creek. So they are two of the last three remaining southern North Caribou populations in Alberta, in provincial lands. And the populations and distributions have been shrinking for many years due to habitat loss from industrial development. So the Upper Smoky's original plan, released in 2025, it was supposed to be informed by multi-stakeholder task forces. So AWA was part of one, CPOS Northern Alberta also participated. So basically it was environmental organizations, municipalities, government, industry, they all got together and discussed certain, like a region or a sub-region. And they all gave recommendations that they all put together, saying, okay, how do we reach that 65% caribou undisturbed habitat? However, those recommendations, none of them were actually included in the draft plan that was released earlier this year. So AWA got together with CPOS Northern Alberta, the Alberta chapter of the Wildlife Society, and other people that usually meet with us, and we reviewed the plan. And what we discovered was that, or what we saw was that it was heavily focused on industrial use of natural resources. Timber harvest allocations were given in critical habitat, and there was no mention of how we're going to get to that 65% undisturbed habitat. And caribou needs were not a part of the plan at all. So we put together this report, like I mentioned, Alberta chapter of the Wildlife Society, AWA, and CPOS Northern Alberta, and we sent it after reviewing the plan. We sent it to federal and provincial governments, Indigenous communities, other organizations, news outlets, and many other people, including industry. So what worried us about this plan? Like I said, that timber cutting and other industrial developments would destroy what was left of the winter ranges of these populations, which could mean that because they don't have that winter habitat to go to, then they wouldn't migrate from summer to winter, and they would potentially stay in the mountains for the winter, which could actually lead them to extirpation because of things like avalanches. So other herds have actually gone extirpated or have disappeared because of avalanches. Yeah. So in our report, we, with the help of from some text at CPOS Northern Alberta, we put together a bunch of maps showing the things that the draft Upper Smoky original plan did not show. So because we wanted to provide feedback and help the public provide feedback as well, we needed to know what were the implications of this draft plan on caribou populations. So what you see here in this map, all the gray things that you see here, all the gray part is disturbed area. So it's, I think this is human footprint. So all of that is what's already been disturbed. And the purple line that you see right here, that's the winter range. This is the summer range separated by that little dotted line. So this is what's already disturbed in their habitat. So I don't think there's a way that you can get 65% out of this. And now what we see here is what has been harvested from the 1980s to 2021. So again, like the part outside the range has been heavily logged, and inside the range there's less logging, but like you saw in the map before this one, there's a lot of human disturbance going on. And something we had that we talked about with the province is we signed a data sharing agreement, which basically the province, the environmentally protected areas, they shared with us caribou locations from since they started coloring animals. So they go into the field, they color the animals, and they know the exact areas where they go. So they share that data with us. So this is a pre-2014 and post-2014. And the way we choose this cutoff was because in 2014, that was when the federal recovery strategy was released for Southern Mountain Caribou. So this is where they were occupying before that federal recovery strategy, and this is after. So maybe narrowing hasn't changed that much, but we can see how Red Rock Prairie Creek is actually not using that area that much because they have lost so much habitat. And then I just wanted to also show you another map. So this is the areas that the plan is proposing to have for harvesting. So this, the kind of like the more grayed out areas, those are pre-20, so those are existing areas. No, sorry, these are a little confused now. Yeah, those are existing areas, and this is the proposed harvest. Basically what they're allowing Weyerhaeuser to log in the next 25 years. So all of the areas that, okay, can you go to the next one and I'll show this actually better. So yes, so these areas are the ones that are proposed for logging in the next 25 years. And you can see the little orange or pinky dots. Those are the ones, those are the areas that caribou are still using. So there's a pretty aggressive overlap of habitat that is left, areas used, and areas that the government is proposing to have logged in the next 25 years. So what we saw with the draft Upper Smoky's original plan was a clear disconnect between the science and data that the government has, because this is publicly available data besides that location, caribou location, but all that data the government has it. So they know where the animals are, they know the areas they use, they know what critical habitat is, but there's a big disconnect between what science says and decision making in the province. So they are not following with the requirements under Section 11 agreement that they are needed to provide habitat for caribou. So there's no actual recovering their populations or recovering their habitat in the plan. And they're still relying on temporary wolf calls as the only measure to protect caribou. Which they, sorry, I should have mentioned that they do work, wolf calls do work, but they can't be the only measure taken. So the timber harvest scenario proposed in that in the draft Upper Smoky's original plan, if it stays the way it is for the final version of the plan, would eliminate the possibility for recovery for Southern Mountain Caribou. If they eliminate their winter range and caribou don't have a place to migrate in the winter and they stay in their summer ranges, that might lead to their extirpation because of the range of the risk of avalanches. So now we're going to talk about wood bison. Does anyone have a question? Maybe we should have a little bit of questions before we go into wood bison, or do we want to wait until the end?
I have a question about caribou.
Sure.
Do they still do caribou patrols?
The province?
Yeah.
I'm actually not sure if they still do them. I know the animals are colored and they keep collecting data. So I'm assuming they might keep going back at some point, do field work and color them or like check the colors. I know indigenous groups do the caribou patrols, but I don't know if at least in the Upper Smoky area, they're still doing it.
Yeah, I think they're doing it actually.
They are?
Yeah, I think that the Wilmore
Mm.
Provincial Park and up by Grand Cache.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's good. So still checking, collecting data. Okay, now we're going to talk about wood bison or wood buffalo. So AWA's vision for wood bison is fairly similar to that of caribou. We want the herds to remain wild and disease-free. AWA believes that bison needs enough contiguous habitat to become self-sustaining. and management strategies that support food security for Indigenous communities. So now we're going to talk about their facts, just like we did with caribou. Bison is the largest North American land mammal. The bulls can weigh up to 2,000 pounds or almost a ton, and the cows up to 1,000, so half of that, 1,000 pounds or 450 kilograms. And they live around 15 years in the wild, and they mature after 2 years. And they're actually pretty fast runners, and they're also really good swimmers. And in the province, we have two subspecies of bison. So one of them is the plains bison, the other one is the wood bison, but we're going to be focusing more on wood bison today. But I just wanted to show you some of the differences. Apparently, because I can't really tell the differences, plains bison have shorter noses, lighter fur, and you can actually see like a distinct cape on their backs, while apparently on wood bison, you can't really tell, they're like not as clear, the difference between like their back and their cape. They have a dense woolly bonnet and rounder humps, and wood bison has darker fur, a square hump, a bit more like triangular heads. And a big difference, I should have mentioned, so we're in Alberta right here, and like a big difference is also their distribution. So if you happen to see a bison in the north of the province, it's very likely that's going to be a wood bison. And if you see a bison south of the province, or like south of Edmonton, it's very likely that's going to be a wood bison. The only place where you actually find both subspecies is in Elk Island National Park, so a few hours east of Edmonton. That's where you can find both of the subspecies, but they're actually keep them separate. So a little bit about history of bison. There used to be across most of North America, so from the north of Mexico all the way to the north of Canada and Alaska, they were the dominant grazer, and some estimations believe that there were almost 60 million bison in the landscape. Some indigenous stories say that if you look at the landscape, it was like black, you could tell that was like all bison, because there were so many in the landscape. They're very important for indigenous culture, same with caribou that I forgot to mention. And something really sad and important about bison is that by the 1900s, they were extirpated, at least from our province and from Canada in general. So all of this, the browner part, that's plains bison, they were both. And by the 1900s, we also had around 200 wood bison, so that's the one that lives in the north of the province. We have around 200 left, but we did have a lot of what was called domesticated, which was just wild bison that was kept in private properties. So this was it's like almost similar distribution, but I just wanted to show you. So this kind of like years in italics, that just shows when the animals disappeared from that area where they went extinct. So like you can see that they were extinct all the way from Mexico. So it wasn't just our province, it was almost everywhere. So in our province, they were gone by the 1880s, and there were 550 left. Some people say there's 200, some people say 500. So the estimation is at least less than 1,000 wood bison left in our province. But yeah, they were gone almost everywhere. And this was caused, I think if you go to the next one. No, sorry, go back. So this was mostly caused after European settlers came to our province. So there was a lot of overhunting, there was a lot of eradication. So because indigenous peoples had such a clear, strong bond or like strong relationship with buffalo or bison, by extirpating buffalo or overhunting buffalo and getting rid of buffalo, they were also hoping to get rid of indigenous peoples, which was extremely unfortunate. So that's why bison was gone from the landscape. However, at the beginning of the 1900s, the recovery process started, at least for Canada. So the Canadian government looked to purchase. So there was someone in Montana who had a lot of bison that they had like collected from the wild. They had a really big herd called the Pablo Allard herd, and the Canadian government bought that large herd and they brought it to Canada. So they brought it to what was Wood Buffalo National Park. There was another national park that no longer exists, and they put a lot of the bison there. However, with moving bison and collecting bison from so many places and the livestock presence, there was a lot of disease in the bison now. So that national park actually closed down because of all the issues that it had with like so many bison being sick. So now that we have a lot of bison around the province. A lot of you can find it in like Waterton or in Banff, but in the wild, they're still not there. Indigenous groups have them. There's like, of course, domestic or like bison ranches, but in the wild, you can't really find them. So in, like I mentioned, Elk National Park, the Elk Island National Park, they have both wood bison and plains bison. But in the north, so the brown parts are the wood bison. So they're actually, someone actually found them there. So they thought all the bison were gone, but they did find that they were still left in like little pockets in the north of the province. And so basically this is what we have in, well, some of the ones we have in the north of the province. So there has been more protection happening for wood bison because they were still wild animals, not brought from a ranch. So we still have them. However, like you can see, the gray ones are adding the herds that don't have any diseases, and the red ones. So this is Wood Buffalo National Park. So all of these herds have some sort of disease going on. So it could be anthrax or bovine tuberculosis or brucellosis. But the Mackenzie herd, the Wabasca, and the Ronald Lake, they don't have any. So bison are actually very important for the environment, particularly, well, they're considered a keystone species, which in ecology means that they have a disproportionately large effect on the ecosystem. So if you remove them, then other species might decline as well. So one of the things they do, one of the behaviors they have is this wallowing, which basically they just go on their backs and rub on the grass, and people think that it's because like it can scratch their backs, it protects them from flies or like ticks or other insects going into their skin. And so by doing this, they create these wallow areas that are like, they don't have vegetation. So this opens up for other plants to grow in there. If it gets full of water, it's like habitat for other species, for insects, for birds. So yeah, lots of changes happen once they start doing this behavior in these areas. They're also really good seed dispersers. So a lot of seeds get stuck. Like if you have a dog and you take them to the park and they get like little burrs on their fur, the same thing happens with buffalo. So they get seeds stuck in their fur, and then while they like walk around to a new area, that seed might fall, and then the plant actually grows in a new place. They're actually really good fertilizers, so they're dung going into the soil. There's nutrient cycling. Also insects, they lay their eggs in their dung, and also the birds go and eat those eggs, or they can eat the insects. So there's like lots of things happening, and of course they were food for predators and for humans. So yeah, they're very, very important for the ecosystem. But what are the conservation challenges for bison? So like almost any species facing challenges, habitat loss and fragmentation is usually the big one. And a lot of these things are caused because of industry. So oil and gas presence, forestry, and this is a picture that one of our conservation specialists took at Elk Island National Park. So that's just a bison crossing the road, which is usually fine, but it could get hit by a car or other things could happen. So that habitat for them used to be all connected, but now there's a road in the middle, which they might be fine crossing it, they might not. Also, disease is one of the things that affect them a lot. Like I mentioned, those 3 diseases, and policy. So government inaction is one of the big things that might affect them. So if we don't actually start fixing anything with policy action, with government action, like there's very little that can happen to support the species if we don't change policy. And one of the big things is that in Alberta, plains bison, so the one that lives kind of like south of Edmonton, is not considered wildlife because it was brought from ranches and it doesn't really in the wild and many things. But yeah, so AWA is fighting for plains bison to be considered wildlife, so they can have those, so they can have protection. So now we're going to talk about the work that we do at AWA with to protect bison or buffalo. So we are part of a cooperative management board called the Ronald Lake Buffalo Herd Cooperative Management Board. So what the board wants, so first of all, this particular herd, they're self-sustaining, they are disease-free, and they have clear connection to indigenous peoples in the lower Athabasca region. So there are many indigenous peoples in that area that have clear connection, even more for time immemorial, with this herd. The vision from the cooperative management board is pretty much the same as what the herd is. So we want the herd to remain self-sustaining free to roam and disease-free, and that supports cultural connections, traditional practices, and sustainable use. So this board was created back in December of 2019 after an imminent threat assessment. So the government, the federal government, did this imminent threat assessment, and basically meant that if we didn't have immediate action to protect the herd, it would go extinct, or like the population would be extirpated. So the action that was taken was to create this board to advise the Minister of Environment and Protected Areas on matters related to the long-term sustainability of the herd. So basically, and this is the first cooperative management approach made in Alberta. And if you go to the next slide, we can talk about who's in the board. So we have 7 Indigenous groups from the Lower Athabasca region. We also have the Alberta Wilderness Association. We are the only environmental group that's part of the board. We have 2 industry representatives, which are Alberta Pacific Forest Industry and Teck Resources Limited, which is an oil company. We have the Canadian COSIA, or the Canadian Oil Sands Innovation Alliance, and the Ministry of Environment and Protected Areas. And we also have a representative of Environment and Climate Change Canada from the Wildlife Canadian Service. So there is like everyone is there, everyone who can actually do something to protect the herd is part of the CME. So what do we do as a board? We are working on the creation of a management plan. So basically, what do we need to do? What does the government need to do to actually protect this herd so it can remain self-sustaining and free roaming and free of diseases? So we look at the threats. So we find where the threats are coming from. So they might be logging leases in the area. There's an oil sands lease in the area. So we know what the threats are to the herd. So what can we do so these threats don't actually have an impact on the herd? We also have local Indigenous conservation programs. So the 7 groups that I mentioned, the 7 Indigenous nations that are part of the board, they do have a lot of research programs and Indigenous knowledge development to protect the herd. Yeah, so and we try to like use both Indigenous knowledge and Western science to help create this plan. And okay, with this one, I just wanted to so for like one of the things we usually have to do fairly often is, so you can see here the Ronald Lake Bison herd. This is the border, like the south border of Wood Buffalo National Park. So they usually, or sometimes, get really close to the Delta herd, and the Delta herd has diseases in them. So kind of like, what can we do to stop the Ronald Lake herd from coming closer to the Delta herd? Also, if there are threats creeping from the south, like if there's oil sands development or logging, so it's very likely that if we start pushing the herd north, are they going to go more into the park? Are they going to get closer to the Delta herd? Like, how can we stop that? So we've talked about like all the possible things, like can we create a fence? Can we, which is not actually feasible, that we've learned. So yeah, so what we're doing right now with the help of Canada, Parks Canada, is they do a monitoring program of their herds, and they usually keep an eye on the Ronald Lake. And if the Ronald Lake individuals are getting too close to the Delta herd, they usually notify the board, and then decisions are made, taken. So sometimes what can happen is that they use a helicopter or a little plane to kind of like gently push the Ronald Lake individuals further south if they're getting too close to the Delta herd. So yeah, those are the things that the board has to decide, like how do we keep them from getting in contact with the Delta herd? Would they avoid contact by themselves? Would they know that the other herds have diseases in them? Kind of like we're like navigating all those things to protect the Ronald Lake. So in summary, some species need a bit more help than others, and that's the case for caribou, big case for caribou, and that's what we're working on the Ronald Lake buffalo herd. So industry sadly is almost always responsible for species declines. So the activities they do on the land have a big impact on what happens to species, and this is mostly due because of habitat loss. And we know that conservation takes time, but recovering a species and landscapes takes even longer. Something that I really didn't have time to talk about is that in the Upper Smoky Subregional Plan, the province estimates that maybe in 100 years, caribou is gonna have enough habitat to be self-sustaining, but we don't really know if caribou would have another 100 years without habitat. So we know that that takes a very long time. If they need those 80-year-old forests, if we're gonna plant those forests today, that they're gonna be using that habitat in 80 years from now. So both the caribou and buffalo are very important for their ecosystems. Like I mentioned, caribou is an indicator species, so if they don't do well, we know that ecosystem is not doing well. And buffalo are important because they keep a bunch of other pieces working in their environment. And they're also very important for indigenous cultures. And environmental organizations and the public need to hold government accountable. So if we don't keep pushing for the government to do something, they very likely won't do anything. So what can you do to help? So kind of like the thing that we always say is to email your MLA or your MP and tell them you care about wild spaces and wild species. So if they get a bunch of emails of people telling them the same thing, they're gonna be like, oh, people actually care about these things. You can support our work by joining the Alberta Wilderness Association. You can get a lifetime membership. It's pretty cheap. And you get our Wildlands Advocate, which is our quarterly magazine. You can make a donation, you can subscribe to our newsletter, follow us on social media, tell your friends, share our posts, and also enjoy the outdoors in a responsible way. We also have our Ventures for Wilderness program, which Lindsay runs, and that basically takes the public to the outdoors so they can actually like interact more with nature and know, and we can tell them why we care about these spaces. And that's basically all I have for today. Any questions? Sorry, that was a lot of information.
That hurt.
In the Ronald Lake?
Yeah.
So the latest estimation I've heard is around 450 individuals. So yeah, so in some of the conversations we have in our group is, when is the herd gonna be at a place where indigenous people can actually do a harvest or like take one individual from the herd without actually hurting the population growth? Or like, are they gonna be okay if we take one individual? So that's also one of the conversations we have when we monitor population. Yes.
And I heard that bison in particular are being monitored and also relocated every other year, for example, in Elk Island,
Yes.
because of hyperabundance. That doesn't happen, I think, for deer because it's semi-permeable.
Mhm.
Like we do have very high barriers.
Yes.
Bison can't get over. I'm not saying that deer can. Apparently it's easier for them. So the relocation process, I've only seen sort of footage when they have provided provided bison to other locations.
Yes.
But you were saying that they're trying not to have these relocations because of the risk of either a parasite or an endemic disease that could possibly become,
So I don't think any of the bison in Elk Island National Park have any diseases. I might be wrong, but I think they're disease.
There's one.
Oh, there's one. Oh, no.
Yeah, I learned about it at the Alberta chapter for the Wildlife Society.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very unfortunate. So usually before they move the animals, because this is usually done more toward, like they send them to indigenous, for indigenous groups. Like they don't just send them to anyone who wants a bison. Like they move them to like the areas where indigenous peoples live. And I thought they do quarantining and testing before sending the animals. So there is a process. They don't just ship the animals. There's a process so they know that they're not actually transmitting more disease in the landscape. But yeah, I didn't know there was one. That's very unfortunate.
In Latin, it starts with an O.
Oh.
Yeah.
I don't
So
know
it's
those.
an endemic parasite, and
Oh,
I don't know
okay.
if it's bacillus, but it's another parasite. Yeah.
Oh,
And so.
okay, that's very unfortunate. Well, hopefully that won't stop their program if they can like keep it to just that one individual.
And just to piggyback on that question, and
Yeah.
I'm sure there's probably other questions, I don't want to take up a lot of time,
Thank you.
but I wanted to thank you for your presentation. It is so important.
Thank you.
My question really is about how do we gain the I guess maybe the option or the opportunity to start putting this into our curriculum for our students.
Oh,
And I know CPAWS had done it a number of years where there was actually a Caribou and You curriculum based around grades 7, 8, and 9.
Okay.
And it was really good. I used it as a teacher. I'm just
Oh.
wondering if they're thinking about revisiting that.
Yes, I think that's a great idea. I love it. So the things that we do is like we go to schools and present like information like this. But I'm sorry, I don't exactly know how, I guess getting in touch with teachers, but I don't really know how school systems work to, who do you contact to?
Environmental educators.
Yeah, environmental educators.
Mhm.
Maybe, because I know like we do programs in schools. Like we'll present this at universities as well, but yeah, for like younger people, that'd be great if we could have like restart that, that would be amazing.
There's a program called Howl,
Okay.
HOWL, like as in Howl
Oh, okay.
Experience.
Uh-huh.
And they're doing one at Chief Hector YMCA this
Okay.
November 5th to 9th. And it would be really great if you guys could potentially be there at their fair on November 8th.
Yes, okay, that's next weekend.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I'm gonna look into that. That would be really great.
Okay.
We would love to have this, people teaching this in their schools. That'd be amazing.
Well, these are Indigenous youth.
Oh, perfect. That'd be great. Any other questions? Oh, I didn't know I was in. Okay.
I just was wanting to see if there's anybody dropping stuff in the chat. Click. Right.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. Very happy to have you here. So great, so powerful.
Well, thanks for driving all the way.
Yeah,
Thank
no,
you.
Here, see us. I wish.
Yeah, I
Oh,
appreciate
you're
it.
getting lots of likes.
Yeah. Lots of heads.
That's
Yeah, and yeah, a reminder for folks, if you're in Edmonton this evening, Pamela and I will be at St. Andrew's United Church. There's a concert featuring a brand new work about species at risk, and we'll be doing a kind of chat with the composer during intermission, more about species at risk.
Well, thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Oh, they can unmute themselves. Or